congratulations to Sue and everybody for putting on such an excellent and thought-provoking day. My credentials to be here are that I used to be at Oxford University, where I'm billed as being as the director of the African Studies Centre, but more recently I've moved to be the Professor of Democracy at Birmingham University. But more particularly, I am a columnist for Kenya Sunday Nation newspaper, so I'm not a journalist, but I do engage with the media, and I have fortuitously witnessed the previous election in every country that's going to be talked about on this panel, which is Uganda, Nigeria, and Kenya. To introduce first our discussant, Daniel Branch, who's from the University of Warwick, a professor who's well known for his books on Kenyan history, both Mau Mau, but also the history of contemporary Kenya, bringing us up pretty much to the present day. We also have on Skype Seth Ouma, who suffers the indignity of being my student. He's a master's student at the University of Oxford and is currently doing his fieldwork on opposition politics in Kenya, but he's going to talk to us today about a project that we've been doing on Kenyan media. Here in front of you, we are very, very lucky to have two very prominent speakers. Irene, Odida, sitting next to me from Uganda, who is the CEO of the Ugandan Association of Women Lawyers. And next to her, we have Kayode Samuel, who's a Nigerian journalist. Many of you will know the Vanguard newspaper, for which he's one of the lead writers, but he's also well known for his role within the journalist community in Nigeria. They both have very glittering CVs that are very long. I'm not going to read them out now because it will take time away from questions, but please do consult the speaker bios that are available. We're going to start with Seth because we have him on a slightly tenuous Skype connection. So we're going to try and get him in as soon as we can to make sure that the connection holds. So we're going to start by hearing a comparison of the Kenyan media in 2007 and 2013, the last two elections. Seth, over to you.
Okay, thanks so much. So my name is Seth Ouma. I'm studying at the University of Oxford, but currently in Kenya. So I'm presenting actually from the State County in Western Kenya. And the presentation I have here is out of a paper with the collaboration and also the Discussant at the University of Nairobi in Kenya. So the title is Peace but at what cost? The coverage of elections and conflict in Kenya, and just something. This is drawn from the work we did on the Nicodem project, which me, myself, and Mr. Kawa also part of. So, I'm hoping that you can see the slide from your end. The title I have stated Peace at what cost, the media coverage of elections and conflict in Kenya. And the paper generally looks at the conflict that the media and journalists often find themselves caught up in the political conflicts that they divided transitional democracies. And
can I ask him to speak a little slower, maybe?
Glad we are trying to talk about
Seth, could you speak more slowly?
Right?
Could you speak more slowly?
So Seth, the line isn't very good, so you cut out a little. So if you speak a little more slowly, it might be a little easier. It's not your fault, it's the line.
Oh.
And make sure you speak into the microphone.
Okay, fine. So I'm saying that the paper generally looks at that the media and journalists often find themselves caught up in covering political conflict by the transitional democracy. And in that regard, we are looking for doing a comparative analysis from the 2007-2008 pre-post-election dialogue. I hope I'm not so passionate. So, in particular, we focus on how and what journalists and editors will be faced with the difficult trade-off between prioritizing the work of all doctors and the democracy. And it's historical that a problem of overcompensation, so that in the 2007 case, there was a total game to where they just they were not as responsible, but then indicative, and they tended to underscore this at the expense of democracy. So, in terms of the methodology, this paper is on established journalists and the civil society people we also did a fieldwork observation. There was also a careful reading and coding of relevant articles from Kenya's leading dailies, that is the Daily Nation and Standard. So the media also has the Star. There's also a day called the Star, but not a particular. And we also organized of other media, especially social media, but we underscored traditional media, especially of us and the vernacular radio, because they are eminent shaping place in research and also due to the fact that social media was not so much at Kenya, not returned to the Kenya. So, in terms of our research papers, as under what circumstances do episodes of election-related conflict and reflect the challenges in innovation and the partiality of the media? And the second question is, what pressures does the thing?
Hi Seth, I'm sorry, we can't really hear you very well. Can you try moving the microphone a little bit further away just to see if that improves it? We just can't hear you very clearly. It's not you, it's the line.
Okay. So if I put it there, can you hear me right?
I think that's a little better. Yeah. Can you?
Okay.
Even further away.
Yeah, okay, fine. So I was saying that the first question we are asking is, under what circumstances do episodes of election-related conflicts present the greatest challenges to the internal cohesion and partiality of media? And the second question is, what pressures does the tension in democracy place on journalists? And our findings on the first question is that, especially drawing on 2007 and 2008 case, we argue that election-related conflict is particularly problematic. Social cleavages that motivate conflict are also present within, between and within the media establishment. That is, the journalists who are practicing belong to particular groups. Sometimes this fits the work they do because they tend to get no equality. So this in a way compromises the balance and accurate coverage of everybody. And on the second question, we draw on the 2013 elections in Kenya to argue that the twin imperative for supporting the democratic process and promoting peace placed journalists between a sealer and a challenge, that is between a rock and a hard place. And in such a situation, the journalists find themselves unable to and hopes of the society where, for example, they are expected to promote a democratic credentials, but also promote peace. So they have a situation where they can choose of one or the other. So starting with the 2007 case in particular, we can observe that there was a lot of optimism that due to a number of factors. The first is that in Kenya experienced a very peaceful transfer of power from the former President Moi, the newly elected President Kibaki. And in 2005, this President Kibaki easily conceded defeat in a referendum led by the Odida group. And so, in spite of him, that is Kibaki, not fulfilling the pre-election promises they had, for example, the Odida group, there was just a general feeling of some optimism, both domestically and internationally, that there would be some transition necessary, or if there would be no transition, but generally the things would be okay. And this could be seen in institutions like, for example, the former ICwS chair, Commonwealth, in internationally, I think just the election as a professionally as well as referendum. However, as what this was happening, a number of factors were being observed already being or building blocks for ethnic conflict. The first was the Celebration of which created the Kikuyu versus the leaders coming from several regions in the country. Unlike that, it was largely seen as a Kikuyu thing. The other was the Kikuyu, after trying to come back, there was an image of them trying to consolidate their supremacy, and this was not maybe a good thing among. Okay, it was not seen as a good thing among other Kenyans.
Chairman, I'm sorry about that. I think you can appreciate, especially in an event, like this, why we wanted to bring a young Kenyan scholar to talk to you, and especially why we wanted to try and get him even though he was in the field. So we're sorry that didn't work, but you can understand why we tried. I know a little bit about this paper, so I can maybe fill in what Seth would have said, which is a great shame. I was giving him a lot of time because I didn't want to have to be the white guy in the room speaking for the Kenyan who can't be here. But I think the technology has defeated us, so you'll forgive me for doing this. The paper is basically a paper about comparing 2007 and 2013 elections in Kenya. And what Seth was saying quite eloquently, but you couldn't hear him because of Skype, was that the 2007 election was seen in many ways to be a terrible election in the Kenyan context. It was an election that was marked by effectively government rigging, that was exposed by a number of different people. But that put the media in Kenya into an incredibly difficult position, because many of the newsrooms in Kenya were split, both ideologically and ethnically, along similar lines to what we saw within the party system itself. And so journalists actually had to decide, how are we going...
He's calling.
Oh, sorry. I don't think you've seen my message.
Let's give it a shot, one more.
So if there was any indication the line was getting better, I think we could go back, but it's probably better not to. So the 2007 election placed Kenyan journalists in a very difficult position. How do you respond to an electoral context and allegations of election rigging and what followed the election, which is 2 periods of significant election violence, one period in which communities aligned to the opposition, broadly speaking, attacked communities aligned to the ruling party, broadly speaking, another period of revenge attacks where figures close to the ruling party organised attacks against figures associated with the opposition. How do you engage with that as a media when you don't agree within the newsroom on what happened? Right? You don't agree on who rigged the election, you don't agree on the extent that the election was rigged, but you also don't necessarily agree on what comes next. 2013 election, though, also places Kenyan journalists in a very difficult position, because although there's no violence, there is the rise of what Kenyans now call peaceocracy, the demand that peace must be observed and respected above all else. This is not a Kenyan phenomenon. In the Ghanaian election last year where I witnessed exactly the same phenomenon. Everybody speaks about peace before the election. You will see if you go to Ghana or Uganda or Nigeria, the newspapers will be full of the peace narrative in the days leading up to the polls, and there is a good reason for this, which is that in almost all African countries, the spectre of ethnic violence is one of the key figures, the bogeymen of history, but also that is used often by ruling parties to repress freedom of speech as well. So it has a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it is genuinely legitimate and a major concern, but it's also manipulated by the ruling party. So this is a paper about these 2 moments in Kenyan history and how journalists attempt to deal with the challenges that they get put under. The first research question is, what are the circumstances and episodes of election-related conflict present the greatest challenges to the internal cohesion and impartiality of the media? And the second is, what pressures does the tension between peace and democracy play on journalists? And one of the key points of the article is to point out that these 2 tensions actually take journalists in different directions. You can't always promote peace and democracy at the same time. And that puts journalists in this impossible position, which is what Seth was trying to talk to you about. So, to skip to where Seth was in the talk. This is 2007 in Kenya, a period of ethnic violence that many people feared would break out into a civil war that would undermine national cohesion for years to come. Newspapers ran headlines called things like "Save Our Beloved Country." In the wake of that, the media itself was blamed for its role in the violence. This happened through a number of different elements. The media was very unsure on the result of the election, and some of the media claimed that their own databases had been hacked, which meant that they didn't have reliable results, but they printed them anyway. At the same time, there was a promotion of hate speech through vernacular radio that many of you will know about. Keith Somerville and others have written about this in the past. But there was also a failure to accurately report on violence. The media censored themselves and refused to print ethnic names along with violence. So you would get quite detailed accounts of violence, but without the names of the groups that had been involved in the violence, which of course to some extent undermined your capacity to actually understand what was going on. That was done in the name of diffusing the violence rather than fueling the flames of violence. But what it meant was that the journalists were deliberately sort of hollowing out their own analysis. The consequence of this was a peace narrative in which journalists really started to second guess their own role. They felt that they had been responsible. And to some extent, their feelings of responsibility were related to the fact that one of the people tried on charges against crimes against humanity at The Hague was not a politician, but a journalist, Sang. Right? He was tried for a role that he was supposed to have played in vernacular radio station CAS FM in fanning the fuels of violence. So the media felt that it was under attack, but also recognised that it had not done itself justice in that election. What we see over the next 4 years is a massive campaign of peace and a push for peace journalism in almost all aspects of Kenya. We see religious leaders organising massive rallies. We see civil society organisations, BBC Media Action, MISA from South Africa and so on, coming to Kenya to train journalists across the country, both in rural areas and in capital cities, on how not to cause violence. But one consequence of all of that was that journalists felt that they were being told to look the other way when they came to a controversial story. And we have lots and lots of interviews with journalists who felt that the training went beyond the line of responsible journalism towards actual promoting peace journalism, in which you don't necessarily report on, for example, abuses of power by the government that might be controversial and lead to opposition protests, because your first and foremost responsibility is to peace rather than to democracy. And this is the tension that emerges in the run-up to 2013. So what we then get is high levels of self-censorship. Journalists who tell us that they saw examples of election rigging in 2013. They saw people stuffing ballot boxes, but they didn't report it because they thought that would trigger violence, and they had been told that any element of violence that resulted from media reporting was directly blamed on them, and they could be held accountable, for example, by the International Criminal Court for that. So you actually had a media going into the 2013 elections that was standing on eggshells. This is the sort of thing that then happened afterwards as journalists started to think about and reflect on their role in that election. This is a Kenyan journalist who works in one of the top 2 newspapers who said, remember that of all the professions, only a journalist was presented to the ICC, Sang, who I was telling you about a moment ago. So in the 2013 elections, there was a lot of self-censorship within the media because everyone seemed to be tiptoeing around. Whether it was a good thing, I don't know. We have a number of other journalists who speak up on this as well. There are people who say, we should have followed up on the IEBC, that's the Electoral Commission in Kenya, which failed comprehensively in 2013 in a number of key areas of the elections. I don't think we did, because the electronic and voter system failed. So I think we failed. What the editor is saying here is, we didn't hit the IEBC hard when we knew they were going to fail, because we were afraid of causing violence and triggering unrest, so we pulled our punches. But now we can look at it in hindsight. We let down the people, and we let down democracy, and we let down the opposition. So there's a very, very difficult trade-off, and what the paper tries to do is not to blame journalists or to criticize journalists, but to understand the world in which journalists operate. So it's a very quote-heavy paper that tries to be sensitive to the challenges that journalists face every day. And what we try and talk about is the different pressures that journalists face, and that there isn't actually a perfect scenario here. Kenyan journalists in 2013 felt they would be letting somebody and some principle down, whatever they did, whether they reported or didn't report on a particular issue. They felt kind of trapped in an impossible situation. But we also point out that one of the problems with the media in Kenya in 2007 was explicitly this point, that the cleavages within the political system were replicated within the newsrooms of the major media houses. This wasn't just the media, this was civil society. There are people within the human rights organisations in Kenya who will tell you that their press releases were not released by their press officers because their press officers disagreed with their interpretation of the violence. So ethnic tensions and interpretations of the events within civil society and within the media made it very difficult for journalists to know how to respond. And that's the end of the presentation. So let's move very quickly. I know that took a little bit longer than we wanted it to because of Seth. Let's move quickly to Irene and then Kayode, and then we'll take, but I think these three presentations are going to connect very much to each other. So we're going to take all three, then the discussant, and then have a longer period for Q&A. Irene, please.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. That was quite interesting. Just to correct my name, I'm Irene Ovonji Odida.
Apologies.
Odida is my husband's name, so I'm very particular about that. It's hyphenated, but that's okay. I was asked to talk about the Ugandan situation. And I wanted to, talk about elections, media, and what happened in Uganda. We had elections last year, 2016. And the first question that came to my mind is, what is an election? The cynic's view. And I think, for me, an election, in addition to us talking about it as a process in which citizens are able to express their views about who should rule them, I think it's also very much a process through which power is contested. So you have a power contestation. It might be political power, but it can also be economic power. And that's a factor that therefore influences what happens in elections. The other thing to take into account is that what happens in any country, including in Uganda, has several drivers. So you will have the national drivers that shape what happens in the election. What's the local political economy in the country? And you also will have global drivers and stakes and interests. Both of those have an influence on the election. Now, as far as the local political economy goes, I think the critical thing for us as far as the 2016 and previous elections go is that over time, we have had the same president in office from 1986 and to date, who came in through a guerrilla war and then went through elections from 1996. So he's run about 3 or 4 times in elections, and each time it's the same person who gets elected. In the situation in Uganda has shifted from 1995, when we had democratic revival, a constitution that was brought in that had a lot of principles around human rights and so on, entrenched certain principles of democracy, to what we have now that many commentators have described as a neo-patrimonial regime. So you have centralization of power, particularly in the presidency, not just in the government. You have a situation where there is exclusion through many of the policies, macroeconomic policies adopted by the government, many of which reflect the neoliberal ideals and principles that were pushed by international financial institutions, the World Bank, the Washington Consensus in the 80s, and which Uganda then adopted wholesale and implemented. And that has led to what Oxfam recently described as growing inequality in a report that was released about a week ago, showing that we have massive growth, but also increasing inequality. So we have growth in which fewer and fewer citizens are participating. And within that, there is a nexus between the political elite and the economic elite. Often you'll find they are the same. So there is a connection between the captains of industry and so on, those who dominate the economy, and the political class, the political elite. Often they are both local and international. So you will find there's a connection between, say, companies, multinational corporations involved in the most lucrative sectors of the economy, which include extractives. We have oil that's been discovered recently. So a connection between them and the political elite locally. And within that situation, the institutions of governance, the classic 3 arms of the state, do not function as they should. Most decisions happen in an informal space. So while you have a national parliament that is elected regularly, you'll find that the ruling party controls 80%, about 80% of the MPs, and decisions are made in the ruling party caucus. And in that ruling party caucus, there isn't democracy. So it is not even contestation within the ruling party, but a lot of decisions come from the head of state. So this is where decisions relating to elections and so on, laws are often decided in that space, including the laws relating to elections. And we also see in the judiciary that there is contestation between those who would stick to the formal principles relating to governance that are set out in the Constitution and those who follow the informal patronage system. So in the judiciary, we have a phenomenon that has been referred to as appointment of cadre judges. So there is that contest between members of the judiciary who seek independence and observation of rule of law, and those who see their interests as towing the line of the head of state. So these are some of the factors impacting on our elections, alongside the neoliberal economy, which brings in very strong external interests around the major economic sectors. One of those that impacts on women, and particularly young women, is say in the horticultural sector, where you have no labor standards, no control, deregulation, and so practices of companies that impact directly on the rights of women, particularly young women working in that sector, are completely not controlled. Now, for the elections, and I give that as a background for us to understand the context within which the 2016 election happened. These were the first elections in which not only national observers, such as my organization has participated in election monitoring for some time, not only national civil society organizations, but also external observers. For the first time, external observers found that the elections were flawed. Previous elections were flawed, but this was the first time that we had the Commonwealth coming out and saying that, the EU Observer Group also coming out and saying that, the US Embassy coming out and saying that, which of course boosted it boosted what local observers had been saying for a while. Some of the ways in which the elections are managed, and it's important for us to appreciate that when you have a flawed outcome, it is not just what happens on election day that causes that, but all the preparations and practices of governments leading into that, as well as the connections between state agencies with a role in managing elections and external actors, including development actors of the donor community. So in the run-up to the 2016 elections in Uganda, which included the presidential, parliamentary, and local government elections, and this was the third since 2005, when a multi-party system was introduced, we had a number of changes created in our laws that we saw as setbacks to media freedoms. There were some rulings by the judiciary against government agencies for refusing to release information to organizations seeking, under Freedom of Information legislation. So we have an Access to Information Act, but consistently the practice had been that government agencies do not honor the requests made to them, in spite of the provisions in the Constitution on freedom of expression and the press. But we also found that while there were court rulings to the effect that the state should recognize and provide the information, the state continued to use provisions of the Penal Code that undermine the guarantees of freedom of the press, including criminal libel and treason. So in August of 2015, 4 journalists were charged with criminal defamation for refusing to disclose their sources for an article alleging involvement of economic elite, prominent business people in fraudulent land transactions. And there were also concerns that there were some political connections of those involved in that practice. Apart from that, we also see that the agencies such as the police and other security agencies were used consistently to intimidate and harass various media. In June of 2015, the year before the elections, there was an arrest of a gentleman working at the USAID who was suspected of being an anonymous Facebook critic of the president and his government. And the gentleman who was arrested was charged with promoting sectarianism under the Penal Code Act and misuse of computers in contravention of the Computer Misuse Act. However, the postings and so on social media continued. So the question was whether the state had arrested the right person. We saw over time in the lead up to elections a number of media of journalists being arrested, including talk show hosts and so on, closure of stations, of a particular station, which relates to an independent media institution, and also closure of talk shows for hosting either individuals who were critical of the state or individuals coming from political opposition parties. In some instances, the state followed up to ensure that the journalists who had hosted those shows were lost their jobs at the stations, or sometimes had conditions that the stations had to then accept as conditions for them to continue to operate, which would include lack of access for persons deemed critical, including people coming from opposition parties. While in Uganda we have a Press and Journalists Act that ostensibly allows or enables journalists to organize themselves, into an association, the National Institute of Journalists of Uganda. It has provisions that also, which are regulatory, but then have the effect of hampering freedom of expression by the media. For example, the requirement to have a license that has to be renewed annually, and also the lack of independence of that institute itself. So that requirement for a license has a chilling effect on media, who often recognize that having a critical stance could lead to the denial of a license in the following year. Besides these laws that directly relate to journalists, we have some other legislation that were passed close to the elections, including the law relating to NGOs that was quite draconian and has the effect of discouraging critical positions and demand for accountability by NGOs, which often collaborate with the media in the country to provide information to the media, or also to use the media as channels to raise the development and accountability issues that we raise. The second broad issue around the elections was, besides the legal, was relates to the political environment. There were also setbacks to media freedoms in relation to that. So in 2015, there was increased political pressure on the media as various parties in the election started their campaigns ahead of the general elections. As a result of that, there was self-censorship quite often by the media, even leading up to the elections and also after the elections. The time has gone so fast. Okay, so a lot of institutions, state institutions that are supposed to have a regulatory role are used for this, such as the Communications Commission, which is the broadcast regulator, that issued directives in the year before the elections that appeared to be politically motivated. And likewise, unfortunately, the Parliament passed a motion to ban senior journalists from covering their proceedings following concerns about critical coverage by the same journalists. Some of the practices that were mentioned this morning, such as switching off social media, switching off radio stations and so on, are among those that are done. And in addition to that, physical attacks on journalists and sometimes on media houses. So we have had break-ins to media houses, including last week to one of the independent newspapers. The third thing I'll talk about and then stop is the effects of economic liberalization on media freedoms. Some of this was touched on this morning. Uganda is has got quite a liberal policy for the past 20 or 30 years. This deregulation has had an impact on media as well as on other sectors. While positively we have many newspapers, maybe 20 newspapers, more than 150 private radio stations, and also 6 private television stations, we find that the effect of this liberalization economically has been commercialization of the sector. So that you find, to a large extent, access to the media, and through that access to citizens depends on money, on who pays. And so there is a shaping of stories, of priorities, of focus in the media through the medium of money. Additionally, a lot of these private media are owned by individuals connected to the regime. So while on the face of it they may appear to be private, they are certainly not independent. And they do comply with government pressure because of economic imperatives, including the search for advertising revenue. So public interest is often mediated by money, and this shapes the kind of news that gets covered and the kind of issues that journalists or media houses, particularly media houses, take as important issues. We have seen in this same period the rise of social media, and that has created another avenue through which there is debate of public interest issues, but the same issues around liberalization and the whole neoliberal approach to development has impacted on education, on public education, on issues to do with the public. And so you'll find that the level of debate in a lot of these is very much impacted by the depth of analysis, by the depth of understanding, and also the lack of information about imperatives and drivers of some of the issues that appear as public concerns. So, for example, there will be much more focus on local issues without an ability quite often to connect them to international drivers, for example, around the economy and the nexus between political and economic elites. And this impacts on journalists themselves directly because of the type of education that is available and their capacity to carry out investigative journalism, partially because of lack of investment in that capacity, either by media houses or by schools that train the journalists. So in conclusion, I think what I would say is that the situation in Uganda is that while we do have contestation, we do have a lot of journalists who exhibit courage and attempt to break open stories relating to elections and other development issues. There is the issues that constrain them are quite deep and quite often structural. They include both local issues coming from our local political economy, but also international issues that create a connection and a link between international elites, particularly economic elites, and the interests that they have in the country that enable them to link with local elites coming from the political space particularly. And the effect of this, therefore, is a reduction of space, both for the media, but also for other civic actors, including civil society.
We'll move straight on, and then we'll take the Q&A at the end, please.
Right. Thank you very much. I usually like the last slot in a day's conference for very good reason. It's either that or the slot immediately after lunch when people are dozing off. Anyway, let me say first and foremost that the two elections that I would cite my instances for are the two most recent elections, the 2011 election and the 2015 election. Both were remarkable in their own respective ways, which I would also elaborate on later. The 2011 elections was particularly, in terms of violence, very, very bad in Nigeria, especially in the aftermath. And that's why I love the fact that the topic given to me included post-election. And much of that violence also touched some of the institutions of state. The National Youth Service Program, which is one of the core foundational programs of Nigerian unity, was particularly touched by that. And even the media, in terms of where they could access, in terms of where reporters could go to, in terms of whether they could report from certain parts of the country, also bore the brunt. The reason why this is important is that for many years, especially since the commencement of the Fourth Republic, we have the Fourth Republic in Nigeria now. Some people will joke in our newsrooms that France is almost 200 and something years old. It has only 5 republics, but we are 56 years and we've gone through 4 republics already. Anyway, that's a joke for the newsroom. But in the years of the Fourth Republic, which by the way is also the longest stretch of unbroken civilian rule in Nigeria, the earlier republics were, one was 5.5 years and the other one was just 4 years and 3 months, and one was actually stillborn, was never delivered. Anyway, In the Fourth Republic, you have had a lot of these interflows in terms of what media does, whether it is an agency or whether it's a victim, whether it is the one instigating or whether it is the one on the receiving end. But the 2011 election put things in very clear perspective, and a bit of background will be useful in that. 2011 was the first time a major candidate from a non-traditional segment of Nigeria was presenting himself for presidential election. And the reason why many may not understand why there was that much, hula baloo around that election. The fact is that a candidate from the Niger Delta, who was neither Hausa Fulani or Yoruba, who had been the two groups interchanging leadership, was presented and by the national ruling party. So that introduced a very, very strong element of novelty. Of course, the traditional power groups naturally didn't quite like that, but because of the incumbency factor, which had, up till the time of the last election, carried very far in our politics, he was able to go in. So the violence that erupted can be traced to that, apart from the fact that the party that he represented, which was then the ruling party, also had not been up to par. So that was a very big issue. And the way the press responded to it, also further helped somehow to aggravate things. The press came up with the coinage of, power shift, this whole idea that power was shifting. And for those who felt that they held the power before then, it wasn't sweet music, And of course, there was a lot of preparation of the minds of people, especially the mobs that did much of the killing. So such narrative, such, sloganeering somehow aggravated things, and the press was right in the center of that. Then, of course, we moved to 2015, which again was remarkable in that in the history of Nigeria, it was the first time an incumbent was going to be deposed through electoral means. And also, the background to that is also quite critical, because it was also the first time that you have a grand national coalition, against an incumbent, which is the current ruling party. But again, let's go back a bit, because in looking at these things, I just started with those two elections. But in terms of the makeup of the media in Nigeria, we need to recognize the fact that the media took off from an adversarial position. The media is a creation of colonial rule. That is the modern media as we have it. And it took off from the standpoint of being opposed to the colonialists. And that has carried through. Even after 56 years of independence, there is still a very strong anti-government stance to the media. And it's nice to have that in mind in order to be able to make sense of some of the things that happen. Although these days, people, especially after the 2015 election, there have been references to the fact that the media had become quite tame. Somebody used a very elegant description the other time, said the media has moved from being the watchdog to being a lapdog. Again, you hear those kinds of things within the country. But how true that is, I'm not too sure has been established yet, but it is right out there on the streets. Another thing that has impacted the ability of the media to play the watchdog role in our elections is the fact that, especially since 1998-99, after the death of Sani Abacha, when preparations for the Fourth Republic got into top gear, a lot of media key players have also transited into political life. Many have become members of the House of Representatives. Some became senators. Some even became governors. There has been the suggestion that perhaps that had served to whittle down some of the vibrancy that people used to see in the media. Also, in terms of in Nigeria, we have this very elaborate debating process towards elections. It's important I mention this because that's also another instance where you see the perception that society has of the media. It is remarkable that in both the 2011 and the 2015 elections, this debate became a subject of debate itself. In 2011, the incumbent decided not to participate. In 2015, the person who eventually won the election also decided not to participate. There's also a background to this. In 2011, there was a sort of belief within the opposition party then that because the debate was being, managed by the broadcasting organizations of Nigeria, which is like an umbrella body for broadcast organizations, that they were not likely to get something fair from that. But lo and behold, the next election, the complaint was coming in exactly the other way around. So, and it also speaks to perhaps the fact that the independence that the media used to claim had been chipped away somehow, and people no longer were willing to take them at face value. Now, the other thing is that when you it's fast. In Nigeria today, because of the long years of military rule, almost 2/3 of our years of independence have been spent under the military. These days, when people try to assess the democracy that we have, they don't know whether what we have is a militarized democracy or a democracy, or a government being run by democratized soldiers. That is quite. We have a general in office as president today anyway. The first president of the Fourth Republic was also a general. There was a civilian interregnum. So there is that belief that the carryover from the military era, and that's why people will always tell you that Nigeria is still in some kind of transition. We have not quite exited the full-blown military governance, but interestingly, the institutions have at least managed to survive, wobbly in whatever form, but they have managed to survive. Also, the same transitions have happened within the media itself. The old media baron is not as effective as it used to be, mainly for two reasons. The fact that the economy has affected the ability of people to access media, but more critically for the media itself, the incursion of the internet. Social media is very much, more people get their political readings from going through social media and going online. And increasingly, it is becoming a very strong force. And I'm going to conclude on that because for the coming elections, I believe that social media will be quite critical. And I think that even the people who are in office today know that, which was why one of the very first laws that were proposed in the Senate after the 2015 elections was a law to regulate social media. How they intend to do that, I don't know. But I think the public outcry was so much that they had to abandon it. I'm not too sure they are fully abandoned. I have a feeling that as 2019 gets near, there will still be some talk about doing something about social media and online media. Also, the reason why elections matter so much in Nigeria is that a lot of interests want to determine who rules. Nigeria is still largely a government-controlled economy. So the orientation or the personality of the person who emerges as president is so critical that there's so much investment in that. But also, on the good side, there's also been the dilution of government, of the powers of government media, because of, again, the incursion of social media. And lastly, what I want to leave you with is the partisanship. I'm sorry. The partisanship that many observers have noticed in the media, which is part of what has reduced what you would call public trust or public confidence in the usual information channels. There is the belief that because media is getting more and more partisan, its ability to serve as a check on government has also reduced, and its trustworthiness with the audience, with the people, has also been, somewhat affected. And, in terms of organizations like the Commonwealth, who would want to, come in, I know they come in flying during election time as observers. It's important to note that while not making any case for Nigerian exceptionalism, Nigeria is different in a lot of ways. Nigeria is different especially because the election event in Nigeria is different from the electoral process. You can't fly into Nigeria 2 weeks to an election and get a clue of what happened. It's not likely. So you need to keep, monitoring. And I think that the Commonwealth as an organization had a very raw experience of that during the Kensa-Ruwiwa issue. If the Commonwealth had been a bit more attentive to the build-up, the execution would not have been such a big shock to it. Because, virtually everybody within Nigeria knew that they were going to kill him anyway, regardless. And from reading the body language of the head of state at the time, it was so easy to know. So we can bring this also to the election thing. That in observing elections in Nigeria, the Commonwealth by now should start having markers of what could possibly, because 2019 is going to be perhaps even more, prone to violence than the 2011 elections. Thank you very much.
First of all, I thought they were three very strong papers. I think it should also be said Seth stepped in at very late notice as well to try and deliver that paper, to add to his credit for trying to do so in the barriers of technology. I think there were two key themes that ran across the three papers. I liked very much the watchdogs or lapdogs characterisation. I think that sort of sets up the discussion quite well. The other point I think that came out in all three papers as well is about elections being very long gestating processes, and concentrating on the voting itself and the immediate aftermath completely misses the point. And I think those points were made very, very clearly in all three papers and very, very well. I've got a few somewhat rambling points in two groups. The first relates to the media itself, and the second to the wider context. I should stress at this point, I'm a historian. I'm here as a critical friend, not as a practicing journalist or anything that pretends. I don't come from a media studies background or anything similar as well. So you can shoot me down on those grounds alone if you wish to. First of all, to Seth and Nick's analysis, one point I thought was missing a little was the extent to which Kenyan journalists considered themselves in 2013 in particular to be writing against international narratives. And the message that I wasn't in the country at the time, which maybe I'm guilty then of the final point that was made. One of the points that was most striking was that determination to send international journalists home without a story seems to me to be quite an interesting argument to make. And I would suggest the consideration of why that was such a pervasive sentiment at the time requires self-criticism, not by Kenyan journalists, but by foreign journalists. And why it is certain media houses were seen as perpetuating a certain narrative of Kenyan history and Kenyan politics, and would write that narrative regardless of what was going to happen, shaped the way that Kenyan journalists were writing. I think would be worth thinking about. I liked Irene's point about the deregulation of the media in that wider context of neoliberalism a great deal, and I think it's worth thinking about what that means for journalists themselves on an everyday basis beyond the editorial agendas of what you called, I think very nicely, the private but not independent press. The realities of the profession, the sort of precariat, seem to be particularly keenly felt in many African states and accentuated at moments of crisis. So it's not just about economic security on a day-to-day basis of working on an hourly paid basis or a freelance basis, but also the physical protection that quote-unquote proper jobs with media houses offer. To go back to this morning, it raises a very profound question of who is a journalist. And the discussions this morning, on one angle, Kenya looks quite good relative to other countries where very few card-carrying journalists have been harassed in the way that's clearly the case elsewhere. But if you broaden that out to everyone who delivers news in one way or another over whatever platform, then actually the story is not very good, I don't think. And I'm sure that would actually be a common story elsewhere as well. Now, in terms of the why, I think the why Irene's of the three papers, I think, forced us to think about the wider context to understand the challenges facing media in the post-election context, I think, most strongly. Obviously, the pressure on the media to be responsible in a situation in which other institutions are not necessarily functioning or doing their job is a constant thread through these papers. And I do wonder, actually, are we in danger of beating up the journalists constantly and subjecting journalists to constant retraining, workshops, discussions of best practice? I've got to say, I've always been impressed with the courage, skill and professionalism of Kenyan journalists and editors. And I think emphasising that their role constantly misses the point. The fact of the matter is we're holding journalists to a far, far, far higher standard than anyone else has been held to in these contests. And I find basically they're not able to get away with the things that are going on constantly in election rallies, in everyday conversation, in all sorts of ways. So political context is key here. Broader points, I think, worth remembering. Social media has obviously been stressed in all three papers, and I think it's worth, if we're considering the media, we've got to look at the relationship between government and telecoms companies and thinking about how they work in local context to understanding the dynamics of the media in elections. We obviously talked about bans on access to Facebook, etc. But the relationships, I think, between telecoms companies and the states in many African countries and well beyond are fundamental to our understanding of the operation of the media in elections now, with obvious reference to recent events elsewhere. I think my biggest point that I wish to make, though, is we need to look at journalists in the context of civil society more generally. The challenges that journalists are facing are those that are confronting other parts of civil society on a daily basis. So, three elements to this. First of all, the fetishisation of stability by all sorts of stakeholders, domestic and foreign. That energy, that sense of the creative sort of instability that drove democratisation, that drove the push for independence, has been largely silenced, I think, in many contexts, both by domestic actors and external actors. The argument for stability at all costs, almost, this idea of the sort of peace narrative, I think, is really actually a very dangerous one. And we need to think about this more in terms of external actors. Some of the sort of investors, that sort of thing that was pointed out earlier. It's hard to find voices in global institutions, foreign diplomatic corps, and so on, that are prepared to speak up in the context of contested elections and actually take action. And particularly when it's finely balanced. It's quite easy, actually, I think, to criticise Museveni. It's actually much harder to be critical in where it's much harder to actually see what's happened. And I think that's a crucial point. The other one is, I think the more uncomfortable one, is to think about the value that's attached to free speech amongst the wider population. How do journalists and their champions convince wider populations that it matters that they do their job? Gwyn and the comments at the end of the previous panel set up this struggle as being one between government and people, and I'm not so sure that's the case. I think it may be uncomfortable. We have to accept actually a significant number of. I'll only speak in terms of Kenya. I think a lot of Kenyans are quite comfortable with a restriction on freedom of speech if it brings stability, and I think we have to acknowledge that. The assumptions a decade ago about the ever-increasing popular support for a great liberal project, I don't think hold now, if they ever did. The freedom of the press is not necessarily a priority to citizens, as Martin suggested, for South Africa, and sunny for Botswana earlier, the Liberal project is probably receding in many of the countries we've been discussing today, not advancing. And I think we have to be honest about that. Therefore, it becomes incumbent upon people that value freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, to actually make the case for those things, perhaps more forcefully than has been the case in the past. We can't take for granted the popular support for those values that may have been the case a decade ago.